I'd like to introduce Ms. Joyce Hunter. She's the acting CIO and deputy CIO for policy and planning with the Department of Agriculture, and Ms. Maria Rote, who's the chief technology officer for Department of Transportation. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe spending a couple of minutes about your background and what you're responsible for in your role.
You go first. You can go.
No, you first.
My background. I've been with the Department of Transportation since August this past year, so not quite a year yet, as the CTO. Previously, I've been working in IT for 30 years, in IT, operations, engineering, a lot of background. I've always been in IT my entire career, so the CTO role is probably a pretty good fit for me with my background. Previously, I was with the FedRAMP program. I was the program manager for that. I spent 10 years at DHS before that, worked on a lot of different programs there, from secure flight to a lot of things at USCIS. And even before that with Navy Medical, I had a really cool opportunity there with building Navy Medical and connectivity from the ground up when there was no connectivity, which was actually really cool. Working there for almost 7 years. So I've been in technology for a long time. I am retired military. I was on active duty, retired from the reserves in 2007. So I've just done a lot of really cool things, a lot of things going on at the Department of Transportation as the CTO. They haven't had a CTO in about 4 years. So I've got a lot of things on my plate, and I'm trying to move a lot of things forward.
Thank you.
My name is Joyce Hunter. As was stated, I have the same amount of time in IT as Maria. However, mine is primarily on the industry side. I've been at Department of Agriculture for 2.5 years. Prior to that, I had my own IT consulting business for 5 years. And then I was with CSC in their health consulting organization. 15 years I spent on the healthcare side. Primarily building systems. I was very integrated into building the CMS data warehouse and a lot of their data analytics and big data. I've been involved in big data before it was even known as big data. It was just lots of it. And then prior to that, I spent a good many years with Lotus Development Corporation. And then going back to the dark ages, when I came out of graduate school, I was with Digital Equipment Corporation. So I've seen the whole spectrum, going from mainframes to minis to PCs and now virtual.
Thank you. We want to start out sort of at the strategic leadership level and drill down a little bit. Over the years, like both of you, I spent well over 30 years in the Fed. And it appeared at times that the role of the CIO, CTO, was on a sine wave. I used to think that at times we had an identity crisis about where we were postured in the organization, where we should be postured. My question is, for both of you, where do you see the CTO, CIO role? Where should it be in the future?
Well, I think that there is I think it should be a integration between business and IT. I think you have to be bimodal, not bipolar, but you have to be bimodal in how you deal with your constituents and your customers. I have told people within USDA that the Office of the CIO are advocates, consultants, and advisors. We're not there to tell people what to do. We're there to guide them. Part of my responsibility as on the deputy CIO side is the compliance. So we have enterprise architecture, we have IT governance, and we have capital planning. We also have FOIA, and we also have the chief privacy officer also reports into my organization. So we're there to make sure that the train stays on the rails and we stay out of the hairs of GAO, and that we put together policies that, policy also falls under my direction. We put together policies that are enforceable. and we try to develop policies that we know that we are going to be able to execute in a timely fashion so that everybody knows where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to do. So I think it's a fine line between, on the business side, because IT is only an enabler. You have to figure out exactly what the business outcome, what the business wants the outcome to be. Once you figure that out, then you can backfill and figure out what the technology is. It's never the technology, right? There's plenty of technology out here. It's always the people.
When you look at the role of the CIO, if you go back in time, the CIO role, I think, has just continually changed and evolved over time, because even if you go back more than 20 years, it really wasn't a CIO. It was more of an IT director. You know, even when you go back before that, in the mainframes, it was an IT director, an IRM manager, those kind of, and the CIO role has really evolved over time. And when you look at it, even today, and you look back 10 years, that role has changed. You know, the CIOs are responsible for your desktops and your networks and those kind of things. And even now, the role of CIO, I think, continues to change, because more and more emphasis on the business. The business has access to lots of technology, and they'll go out and buy what they want. But how do you work with the business and help guide them to where you need to go? And I think that role of the CIO will continue to evolve and continue to drive delivery. You know, you talk about business transformation and CX, you know, that customer experience and user experience, UX. You know, the CIO needs to be tied to that business, understand the business needs, you know, and not just say, thou shalt use this technology, but really understand what the requirements are, not today, but for the long term, and look at it from an enterprise perspective. You know, no more is a CIO just about, you know, your desktops or your tablets or your phones. They really got to think outside the box and how you tie some of these things together around mobility, you know, leveraging the cloud is another piece of technology. So I think the role just continues to evolve. Thank you.
A question I have for both of you is there's a rising role of Chief Data Officer. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because CIO organizations used to have that embedded within them. If your agencies have Chief Data Officers, how do they work with you? And if you don't, how would you see their role as helping, being a partner to the business and a partner to service delivery?
I have a Chief Data Officer, Dan Morgan. He started last summer, about a month before I did. Incredible knowledge about data across the Department of Transportation. And he works directly for me, so I have the geospatial officer, I have the chief data officer. So if you look at my role as a CTO, I'm not the CTO for headquarters, I'm the CTO for the enterprise. And when you look at that role, the chief data officer, he is the data officer for the department. And in his knowledge of data, it's not necessarily just an IT function. When you look at data, it's about the business. How does the business use the data? We've got a lot of activities going on around that data. You mean we've completed our data inventory in January, February of this year. One of the things that Dan and I did last fall, he had a lot of really good ideas about data and how it should evolve with the department. We actually laid out last fall a 2-year plan for the department around data. That includes governance, how we're going to handle our data, how we're going to govern it, how the data moves, understanding all that pieces, how we're going to engage the business. So there's a lot of aspects of that, from, you know, data paloozas to the governance to maybe bringing in speakers to educate and really looking at data across the department. I think it's integral to the department, because there's really, now that we've completed this inventory, everybody's like, oh, we got a lot of stuff going on. And where the department's been working in silos, really taking an enterprise perspective to that data and not just reporting up through, you know, a highways reporting or a railroad reporting, but how do you look at that data and how do you analyze it? How do you do the work around it? Look at it from a multimodal function and look at that perspective, and how do you take other data pieces? How do you visualize that data? When you think about, you know, data and tying in other parts of data, think about the West Coast. I talked about this somebody yesterday, that on the West Coast with the drought, right, the ground level has dropped 2 inches. When you think about pipelines, what's the impact of that drought and the ground level the actual ground sinking 2 inches, what's the impact on that pipeline? And oh, by the way, is there an impact on railroads, and is there an impact on other things because of the drought? So when you start taking all this together, doing the visualizing, it's really important that whoever that chief data officer is really tied and understands the mission and the business and why we're looking at this data, and really to lay the groundwork for visualizing it and making it available.
I think both of us are extremely blessed to have two of the best chief data officers. We refer to Dan as Data Dan.
Yeah, he's awesome.
And at Department of Agriculture, we have an acting chief data officer, Bobby Jones. Bobby he was with Department of Agriculture as our chief architect. Then he went on detail to OMB, where he helped write the M1313 data policy. Then he came back to USDA to help stand up, to be my advisor, as well as stand up our data office. And I agree with Maria that the chief data officer has to be part evangelist, part analyst, part guru in all things data. And what Bobby has done in the year and a half that he has been back with us is he has helped establish a data council. So we have stakeholders from a variety of different agencies, as well as OGC and the chief privacy officer. We've established a data publishing policy so that we know exactly what it takes in order to publish a data set. Bobby has put together data stewards. So each one of the 29 agencies that we have within the department has a data steward that's close to the data and can recommend data sets for prioritization every single quarter. So the chief data officer is very important, and like Maria, the chief data officer reports to the deputy CIO. And we have a lot of different kinds of projects that are going on. And it is important for them to know that information, because one of the things that has come out is a organization has used not only USDA data sets from Food Nutrition Service, but also using data sets from state and local and some of the school districts to create an application called Why Hunger. During the school year, there's breakfast and lunch programs at schools. Well, when the schools close down, then where do the kids go to eat? A lot of children go hungry all summer. This is an application that caretakers, parents, teachers can look on this application and find out what churches, community centers, other schools that are open during the summer, so the children can still get nutritious meals throughout the entire summer month. So there is a place for data and the use of data.
Yeah, and I think I want to add one thing on the chief data officer. He needs to know how, or she, they need to know how data moves.
Yeah.
They need to know how data moves across the department, how it comes in, how it goes out. We do so much work with the states, understanding that data, and I think that's just as important as well, how it moves.
Thank you. For those in the audience, yes, sir.
Just a question. So as you look at the role of the chief data officer, and as you're selecting chief data officers, what would you say would be the most important characteristics? Would they need to come from a technical background? Would they need to have been in the organization for some period of time? Or do you believe that they're interchangeable and that it's a mature enough position and process to where they can interchange from other aspects of the job?
From my perspective, you know, what Dan brings to the table is he has a technical background, but he also spent a good bit of time working in the area of CPIC governance, understanding that aspect of the business. So he brings both things to the table. So he's not just the technologist. Now, when we're starting to talk about technology, starting to talk about Tableau and Socrata and those kind of things, and talking about tools, he understands that in the technology, but he also gets the other side of it from the business perspective, because I think that piece of it is just as important. So I think having a mix of both of those and exposure to both is good.
Like I had mentioned a couple minutes ago, bimodal. Mm-hmm. You know, being able to have that technical, yet being able to have a personality, because you have to understand the data, the technical side of it, but you also have to be able to talk to the administrators and those people who are not very technical to understand the data and to articulate what that data can possibly do or bring to the table. We're having our first open data STEM summer camp at USDA for kids 12 to 14 and then 15 to 17. And the people who are actually doing the administration of the summer camp wanted some examples of data sets that could be offered for kids that age. And Bobby was great. He understood the data. He went and talked to the data stewards. He even got them to volunteer some of their time during the camp so that they could work with the kids on data sets and coming up with solutions. And so, you have to be able to walk both sides of the street. Now, the other question you asked was, should they come from inside the agency? That's a hard question because, yeah, it would help if the person understood the Department of Agriculture and how it worked, and we have 29, agencies and missionaries, and this is what they do and that kind of thing. But I think you can probably come in and hit the ground running.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary.
For those out there, how many in your agencies have chief data officers? Interesting. 3. Thank you. Talking about data raises another great question about leadership. Often, in the roles I've had, we've had to go in and brief cybersecurity issues and threats and vulnerability, always with the focus on the information is the value of the capital asset in the organization. Not always were we successful. How do you take that discussion on security and move it more over into the risk side that the leaders, the mission leaders of the agency can understand that better than just talking about compliance reports and vulnerabilities?
Having come through that just recently, and it is difficult because prior to the OPM incident, a lot of our agencies, didn't take it seriously. We were always talking about two-factor authentication, and voluntarily we were 80%, but actually technical mandatory we were about 23 to 25%. Unless it affects them, then it's a technical solution. Once it actually affects them, then it becomes a business solution. And how it affects not only them personally, but how it could potentially affect how they run their businesses. Any kind of activity that would involve farms, farmers, we're talking about food safety, we're talking about fraud, waste, and abuse in the food nutrition program. So I think it has a lot of business application. When you put it into business terms, instead of talking about, well, you need to have a PIV card, and this is what it does, and you get into the bits and bytes of things, and it's not really realistic. But if you make it close to home, close to what they're doing in their businesses, helping them to understand that if they don't take care of things, then this is what's going to happen. It's not real for them.
Yeah, because if you translate it to not technology terms, but risk to the business, what's the risk of your data being exposed? It's your data, it's your system, it's in translating that really in business terms, not technology terms, whether it's protected, like you said, PIV or firewalls, or it sits in the cloud or this, take the technology off the table and talk about risk from a business perspective.
In your roles as leaders, how have you been able to transform strategy, driving business, as well as your program portfolios to improve decision making? Because both of you, your agencies, not only have federal, you have state and local ties.
That was a big question.
Yeah.
So from a strategy perspective, part of my job is to look out over the next 3 years and really help the CIO who's buried in a lot of the day-to-day activities. My job is to look out, where do we need to go with the organization? And, you know, and my job is not just from a technology perspective. I have to understand the business, understand where the business is going. So I'll have technology in my title. My job is all about the business and where they need to be. And from a strategy perspective, really looking forward and helping from the technology front, help guide the business to what are the right tools so that we're consistent from a departmental perspective. But really that strategy is important because, you know, with having some kind of an IT strategy, where you're headed as a department, what your goals are, where you need to be, is really going to drive a lot of what's going on in the department. You know, if your goal is to, you know, I don't know, pick something. I'll back up and say that we've been working on the IT strategic plan for the Department of Transportation. When I came on board, the one that was done, it is what it is. You know, it had some goals in there and it had some objectives, and it was very built up from the bottom up. And it had a lot of information in there about what people were doing across the department. It really didn't have a vision. It had some goals, some objectives, and oh, by the way, a whole bunch of metrics. And I took it apart when I got to the department. And I looked at it and I said, well, you got some goals, you got some objectives, and then there's all these metrics. And they didn't line up. And oh, by the way, nobody was tracking it to say, how do you know when you achieved what your goal was? So we've been working on an updated IT strategic plan that's truly a strategic plan for the department. I think this kind of gets to your question and how you align some of that. And in our working groups, something that came up over and over again is we need an enterprise architecture that's executable. Okay, that's nice. But from a business perspective, do they even know what that means? And when you peel back the onion and you say, what are you really looking for? They're looking for that direction to say, this is where we're headed, these are the databases I should be using, these are the visualization tools, these are our data tools, you know, and some of it comes to using data as a driver for what we do, but really using that enterprise architecture as actionable, tied to the business, part of the strategy, and where we're headed in the long term, and having that vision and says, here's where the CIO says the department is going for technology for the next 3 years, and how are we going to get there? And that really helps communicating with the business, and you know, because that strategic plan is not just about the CIO, it's about the department, and it's about the business, in our case, of transportation.
One of the things, the major thing is to actually work with the other executives, primarily to create common goals that foster increased cooperation between IT and the business. So working with both now at Department of Agriculture, each one of our component agencies has their own CIO. And they report to the administrator. The administrator is the one with the business knowledge. They know, they have the vision of where they want their component agency to go. And the CIO is supposed to supply those tools and solutions that help them meet their mission. And so our part, as I mentioned before, are advisors and consultants, and we try and meet with both the CIOs or the administrators. We have a CIO council within USDA that we meet once a month, and we talk about some of the common issues that we all face. And that's where we typically find out if, you know, how many people have Tableau, so for example. So instead of going around and everybody's buying at different price points, we try and even out the price points. We try to create a common platform for CRM or email or, you know, some of those other things that will allow the CIOs to actually go out and meet their mission, but yet be able to be in this collaborative environment where they can come up with the tools that will help deliver and execute on what the administrators want. Now, because of FITARA, we're going to be able to actually sit down with both the CIOs and the administrators at the same time. In the past, we've either met with the CIOs or the administrators, and 9 times out of 10, the story got misconstrued. The administrators would go back to the CIOs, and that was not what we told them. And the CIOs would come to us and say, that's not what you told us. And so going forward, we're going to be having these meetings with both of them together at the same time so that everybody gets the message at the same time. And we know what our marching orders are for. We are heavily involved in strategic sourcing. So we are picking those areas that there is a lot of groundswell, like CRM, like Microsoft, like some of those other tools that we use on a enterprise basis, and we are renegotiating those contracts so everybody is on the same platform going forward and the same price point.
Thank you. Is governance difficult when you have operating unit CIOs and trying to work up to a headquarters activity?
Yes.
Yes.
So, so when the day is done, let's say you end up in a logjam, in your roles at the agency level, is that where the decision gets made if you can't come to, I hate consensus is bad, but a majority vote?
IT governance is difficult. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Everybody wants to be able to go off and do their own thing. It's herding cats and dogs and rabbits. And so, there's a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth when we apply IT governance. But we are making a lot of progress at Department of Agriculture. We put it in business terms. We have what we call a e-board, which all the administrators come, and we are providing IT governance classes. So they're not 2 hours, they're not half day, they are 45 minutes. And we hit the points, and we don't use any acronyms, and we put it in business terms, and I refer to it as they are a portfolio manager. They would not let Wells Fargo run off and do whatever they wanted with their 401k or their IRA. So they have to take the same attitude towards the investment that's called, and I would use some of the program names, that they are responsible for ensuring that they have these things as part of that, and that is their governance, and they are the portfolio manager, and we are holding them accountable to make sure that that investment is healthy.
So probably two things. I'm going to break myself a note here. We have an IRB, Investment Review Board, that was stood up about a year ago. Fast forward to today, back when the IRB was stood up, they said, from enterprise architecture perspective, we're going to take a deep dive on the HR and financial segments in the department. And this really goes to part of the governance, understanding what you have, how things happen, how things move, what tools, duplication, all of that. That's all part of governance when you look at it. So this is one slice of it. And when we did the deep dive on the HR segment, which we just, I'm not going to say we're done, but there were about 20 systems across the department, 20-something within the HR segment. And we had uncovered another 20-something, almost 30 more. So we've got, 50-something systems across the department. And that runs from access databases to the bigger HR systems. But there was another 20-something that people didn't know about. So when you look at governance, briefing that to the IRB a couple of weeks ago, from their perspective, it's, we've got all these systems, we don't know about that. How did we get there? Well, people are just off buying things. That goes to governance, is understanding where you should be investing your dollars, where you shouldn't be investing your dollars. And what the other thing it clearly did was it showed where we had overlaps and it showed where we had gaps across that HR segment. So we're really digging into part of that. And I say that because as people go out to buy systems across the department, within those component, or in our case we call them modes, those component CIOs, they say, we really shouldn't be buying this because we're taking an enterprise approach. The IRBs reviewed this. They said, go forth, do good things, continue to look at what we need to do, reduce the duplication and address those gaps. So, that's just one aspect of governance, to cut down on the duplication, the redundancy, and really truly identify the gaps where we have them. The second thing around governance that I think will help when you start looking at the governance and the investments and as things get approved by the CIOs is one of the things I'm working on is a technology stack for the department. So around enterprise architecture, tell me a program office that's going to go flip through a TRM or an ARM and go look at it. Tell me somebody who's going to dig into it. The enterprise architecture folks may know what's in it, but who's going to go look at it from a program office? How about if you had a poster or something, a one-pager that said, here's our stack for our department to make it easy so that when they go to invest their dollars, as it's already moving through the process, you know, for that investment, whether it's, you know, with the 300s or the 53, the OMB 300s and 53s. How about if they already know that this is in the approved so that when it gets to our desk, or for our part of the review from enterprise architecture perspective, they already did their homework on the front side because I provided them the tools to do it. How about if that happens ahead of time? So this is something that I'm working on, you know, where within transportation, you know, the plane's taking off and we're throwing parts on it as we go. So while I'm building out a technology stack, we've got segment reviews going on. We're trying to stand up a really good governance structure. We're not there yet. The maturity level's just not there yet. But that was just really a couple of examples of some things we're doing to really, and it really ties into the governance and those investments and the broader picture of how the department invests its dollars and where those dollars go and how.
You know, both of you have talked about, linked to your mission programs and linked to your agency, what you brought up about data and systems that you weren't aware of before or serving a need. How are you looking at, how do we bring that information, those capital assets in to make it available to others? I can use an example. Years ago, I was at a forum where the CIO, Sachs, and I were talking, and they actually, for their mobile workers, because they're really big in Salesforce automation, have completely locked down their mobile platforms, and all data is centrally stored back. So it's accessible and exposed for anyone who needs to use it. And they look at it as it's a corporate capital asset. Because both of you have strong operating locations. How do you try to, I don't want to say rein it in, but you know, get those assets and get that value and potentially use it in different ways?
Well, what we have done is, as I mentioned before, we have a CIO council. So we meet once a month, and then we have an executive board of the CIO council where we talk about those things. We mention, you know, one of the CIOs will, you know, mention that they are looking at evaluating a tool. And then 4 or 5 of the other ones says, oh yeah, well, we already have that, and we already doing this product. And one perfect example is our animal plant health inspection service has a e-permitting for generating permits. And our Forest Service didn't realize that they had a program like that, and they were able to leverage it. And so now we have a common platform for getting permits now that Forest Service could use and other agencies could also potentially use. Now we're going to be creating what we're calling it Digital Services Center right now, where we're going to be able to store all of the apps and have an app store. So for whether it's CRM or whether it's collaboration tools, people who have already developed applications that other components can then take a look at and say, that's about 80% of what I need. And then they don't have to go out and recreate the wheel all over again, and they're just developing it on this platform, which already has an ATO. You know, the platform, and so they only have to get a authority to operate on the application. That saves a lot of time and a lot of aggravation, because typically what happens, and Chris Lowe, who's our CISO, is sitting over there, and he knows this very well, that they wait till the last minute to get their ATO. And they're rushing, and all of a sudden they get to the very end, and it's an absolute, they want us to grant a waiver so that they can, you know, put it out on the market, and, you know, then he says no, and they come running back to me, and I'm going, you know. And so I think that having that CIO council allows us the opportunity to kind of put everything out on the table so people can see in an open and transparent fashion what we're doing.
From the data perspective, a couple of things. The inventory has really made people aware of what we have just across the board. You know, there's a big effort across the federal government to do the inventory. Our data sets are posted up on data.gov, but there's been an awareness that says, as I mentioned earlier, about using data across multimodal, you know, understanding how the data moves, understanding what we have, who can see it, how do we have access to it, who's copying what data, why do we have, what's the authoritative source on some of this data, where's it coming from? But that's really driven interest across the department, and we're really trying to use that interest to really move the ball forward. It says, okay, we're starting to get some interest, we got people that are, want to get into the visualization, we've got taking an enterprise approach to geospatial as well. Something we did a few weeks ago was have a data palooza within the department for 2 days. And we had tables set up in the department, in our atrium, where each of the modes across the department came in and different program offices set up tables that said, here's all the cool stuff we're doing with our data. Some of it's just about data, some of it was really geospatially, spatially enabling that data, all kinds of things. And then we had our vendor community also had tables set up where they were supporting and doing some things. And that's really generating more and more interest. We've had a couple of quarterly meetings now with all the modes across the department, those key data people that really want to leverage the data. So there's been, I don't want to call it an awakening, but hey, look what we've got, and you know what's in the realm of the possible. And that's where you get into the data paloozas and the data jams, where you can say, hey, this is what we can do with our data. Think differently about our data. What can we use? If you bring in, like I said, the climate data, look at the pipelines piece of it that I mentioned earlier. So we've got just a lot of that going on with the quarterly meetings, but just by exposing the data, saying here's what we have, here's what we own, with those data sets is really driven that interest in data.
Are you, there's been, yes, sir.
So when you're doing these data paloozas and all that, and gathering all the data together, how much does context of the data come into play when you're trying to normalize the understanding of the data? Trying to come up with, one piece of data might mean one thing to, the FAA, with respect to, like you said, sinking the land 2 inches, and then it might be something else to railroad. Does that become a challenge, and then how do you overcome and actually define a metric as being part of the business, or the data being tied to one aspect of the business over the other?
Actually, that's a really good question. I don't know that I have a good answer for you, because just the fact that there's communication going on across the department saying, oh, this is what I've got, that's what you've got. How do we use that data, to your point about putting context around it?
Yeah.
Maybe different viewpoints, but maybe we start bringing it together and you have a different picture. That's really where we are right now, is that communication piece and understanding what's in the realm of possible. So I don't know that we're at the point yet where we can say, you ultimately you want to tag everything, you want to have all of that built in. We're not there yet.
And what we have done is we have found that it's beneficial for the folks at USDA to be thematic. So we create themes around our data so that the data stewards know exactly what to go look for. Prior to that, we would very seldom get a good response. But when we say we want to have all disaster data, then they go off and they look for disaster data and they bring it back: flood, mud, fire, all of that. We want to have climate data, anything related to climate. And so they'll go off and they'll hunt around and find those relevant data sets related to that theme. So we find that if we make a theme out of it and make it very thematic, then they know exactly what to get and what to look for. If it's
that probably helps to build their interest in it and take on it.
Yes, exactly.
We've talked over this week and prior years about cloud strategy. Given the aspect on possibly shadow IT or small pockets of systems and data, are you looking at leveraging the cloud more as a repository, as a resource, given that you've got mobile workforce, and both your agencies are out all over the U.S. trying to do a lot of good work. Try to bring
Yes.
that together.
Okay, yes.
We have a cloud, we have just put out cloud policy. And most of you, or maybe most of you don't know, we have a FedRAMP certified data center called NITSE. And so they have, that's what we consider our on-premise, cloud, our internal cloud would be NITSE. NITSE is also our cloud broker. So they will take in requests from the component agencies and then, recommend, try and broker those services to whichever cloud organization fits the bill for them.
I probably had a little better insight walking into this job around cloud than people really understood that I knew walking in the door. While I was on FedRAMP, I had a view into all the OMB reporting that everybody was using around cloud across the federal government. Not only did I have a view into the OMB reporting, I also had a really good relationship with all the cloud service providers, and I knew what wasn't being reported to OMB. So while I couldn't share the two, because I had to be careful, I have a trust with the cloud providers, as an honest broker and independent, and then I saw what was being reported to OMB, so I know they always didn't match, because the cloud providers will say, well, I'm providing this service. So, as I was looking at the security footprint and FedRAMP across the board, I had two pictures. So walking into this job, I already knew what was being reported to OMB by transportation, and oh, by the way, what the cloud providers were telling me that they were really doing for the Department of Transportation. So when I walked in the door, I did ask for the reports, and I asked the governance folks, what's in the spend for the next 3 years for cloud? So I wanted to know this year and the next 2 years out, so 15, 16, 17. What that really showed me was that nothing matched across the board. So what the cloud provider said, what was being reported, and what was in the reporting for governance around CPIC and all the OMB 53s, 300, nothing matched. Fast forward a few, after I was there a few months, I got wind through the CISO that somebody just made an award for a services contract, and oh, by the way, there was a cloud behind it. Right, so there's a cloud behind it. Let me go back to my sheets. Nope, nothing in there. By the way, that particular mode had $0 for spend in 15 and maybe about 10 to 20K in 16 and 17. How the heck did they just do that? It bypassed acquisitions. It passed contracting. Nobody caught that there was a cloud provider behind the scenes on that services contract. So we are now working with acquisition and contracting on education around cloud. That really gets me to that there's a lot of interest around cloud for the department. We do have a footprint in the cloud, and we have quite a few cloud providers. And there's actually been a lot of interest from a lot of the program offices, because where they haven't invested their dollars to upgrade their systems, we have one where the system is the hardware is from about 2003. It's about 4 revs behind on the operating system. It's not supported anymore, and the application software is about 3 revs behind. Guess what? They're a prime candidate to not just lift and shift them to the cloud. We're going to upgrade them and move them wholesale. We're going to take a big step. I'm actually working on 4 solutions right now in the cloud. If you think about transportation, much of our data is public. One of those applications is around geospatial, moving that up into a cloud. Well, I'm looking at a couple of hybrid solutions where around for data, whether it's visualization and storage, for data, taking an enterprise approach again to the department, where I could have something in this cloud, something in this cloud, and oh, by the way, I've got some legacy systems in our data centers, and oh, by the way, I've got a footprint in 3 things right now, and data is going to be moving around. So I've got 4 projects right now that I'm actively working, moving into the cloud. Varying degrees of criticality for what they're used for, in what they need and what we're going to get out of the cloud, because some of this stuff is, I don't want to say stuff, some of this is really leapfrogging and moving people very quickly off their old architectures, where they've been very poor in investing in their life cycle and keeping the system up to date. So we're going to take some big steps and move. Like I said, there's 4 things I'm working on right now.
With your cloud providers, if they're commercial entities, how do you work service level agreements with them? I had a challenge a few weeks ago. We had a major outage that took us down for about 2 working days in an agency that provides a lot of assistance to citizens. In the contract we had with this particular group, it was 4-hour return to service. If they didn't meet the 4-hour time frame, there was nothing. I got on this job into February. There was nothing in there about what happens when you get into, you're beyond your contract requirement, return to service. Have you faced those challenges right now with cloud providers and service level agreements?
The cloud providers, they all have their standard service level agreements.
Yeah.
So they've got their, 5 pages or 10 pages or what have you of a summary of their service level agreements. But you have to make sure from a contracting perspective that you incorporate if you need something more that they're going to provide, and then how are you going to hold their feet to the fire? It's a contract. You have a contract. How are you going to manage that?
Thank you. I'm going to have one more question and then open it up, and this is going to shift to workforce development. Recruiting for the future, developing your current workforce. Both of you have long experiences and done exquisitely well. How are you handling recruiting, progression, training, and retention of workforce today?
That's a challenge, a huge challenge. Workforce development also, IT workforce development also falls into my bucket of things that I'm responsible for. Last known facts and figures are 30% of Department of Agriculture employees will be retiring within the next 5 years. That's a lot. How do we make it interesting for millennials to want to work for the federal government? Particularly with those high-demand jobs now like cybersecurity, where we can bring them into the federal government, give them all the training, and then one of the Beltway bandits offers them 3 times the salary and steals them away from us after 6 months. So we have developed some interesting programs within USDA where we take our 13s and 14s and put them through a program called the IT Fellows. It's like a preparatory before you decide whether you want to go towards SES training or not. But it's a 1-year program where you work within a group of people that are not within your own agency, so it gives them exposure to other agencies and what they do, and they have executive sponsors and they work on specific projects, which is great for the agencies because in these days of resource constraints, then they get this cadre of folks that work on a project that they have wanted to get off the ground for the past few months. So they work on this project for a year and they have a report out. But the unique thing is that they get to do something different 20% of their time. And then we have another project that we have kicked off, and both of these are with the Partnership for Public Service. The other one is the 20% program, we're calling it Ag Connect, where where agencies will post projects that they have, and we take in folks from around the federal government. It does not matter whether they are in agriculture or outside of agriculture, but they will come and they will work on a project for 60, 90, 120 days. And so that's a couple of ways in which we are trying to keep folks engaged, and we have a very well-documented telework policy. So we're trying different things so that we can keep people engaged. It is hard, no doubt about it. Trying to make it interesting to come to work for the federal government. Finding, though, that a lot of millennials want to do public service. They want to have a feeling that they are contributing to the overall, American way. And so that's always a good way of, one way of getting them in. And then once we get them, we have to retain them. And of course, the training is a challenge because with sequestration, the first thing that went was training. So, we've got to get training back into getting people trained and then retaining them with awards or rewards or some kind of recognition.
I think a long-term workforce plan is important. It's critical as technology is changing, as things are moving to the cloud, as your data centers are shrinking, as your, you need less administrators, you need less email folks, but you still need that strength in engineering and architecture and all of those technical expertise, and you really need to look at your long-term workforce requirements. And if the folks you have today aren't the ones you need in the long term, you either need to train them or bring other people in as, you know, maybe people are retiring. But understanding that long-term workforce, what you have today, what it looks like Joyce said, you've got a lot that are going to be retiring in the next few years. I don't know our numbers for transportation. I haven't seen them. But I do know that there's quite a few people that are eligible to retire within the next 10 years. And what's that workforce going to look like? And how do we bring young people in? I mean, I've been a great supporter of, you know, interns and folks like that and bringing them in. And it's not that you're going to come in and work for the federal government. You're going to come in and you're going to do something cool. You're going to work for transportation. Here's all the cool stuff we do. About 2 months ago, I had the opportunity of having about 50 students from SUNY and Syracuse come down, and they were in the DC area. And we spent several hours with them showcasing to them, here's what you could do as a technologist or an IT policy person or something like that within transportation. I can't tell you the number of follow-ups that we had from that group that said, wow, cool, transportation's doing all this stuff with roads and bridges and cars and sensors and testing and bringing those type of folks in, which is just great. They may not be IT per se, but they may live in research and development. They may want to be in IT policy in the regulations part. How does the testing from research and development around the sensors and smart cities and that information, how does that translate to the regulations that are out there around the transportation industry? But really bringing those type of folks in that are really interested in transportation about the mission. So you have a couple of aspects to it. There's a couple of projects that we're working on that we've gotten some interest in from a couple of people that says, you know, the skill sets that we need. You know, when you look at, we're building out a national address database. There is no national address database. The Postal Service has addresses, the Census Bureau's addresses, Google has addresses, everybody has them. But what's that authoritative source for national address database for the country? There isn't one. And we're taking the lead, and we're working with the Census Bureau and others on building that out. For what a cool project for some people to be interested in bringing that kind of skill set in. You need people that are going to think outside the box. How do you get that data in from 50 different countries, plus territories, plus the District of Columbia, plus cities that don't play with their states? And maybe you've got like New York City that doesn't play with the state. I'm just saying, maybe they don't. How do you bring all that in? And you bring in some people that are really creative, you know, that can think outside the box, or how do you use your existing workforce that may have an interest in that to say, oh, cool, here's what's in the realm of the possible. This is something we can do, how we can build it, because you're going to have different data sets coming in from all over the place. So just different projects. How do you visualize data? There's another project we're working on. And how do you get that interest? And then when you start looking at your long-term workforce, do I have the right skill sets to support those type of projects for the long term? Do I need to retrain people, or do I need to hire?
Thank you both. We have time for maybe one question or comment. If not, I want to thank Joyce and Maria. Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of interesting because we don't have a chief knowledge officer. Yeah. You know, with my chief data officer, he's got a knowledge of the business and knowledge of the technology. So we really haven't had that conversation about a chief knowledge officer per se. Mm-hmm.
chief data officer, I think for both of us, takes care of that. Yeah,
yeah,
they do
they're,
both.
they're really filling both of
Yeah,
those.
yeah, they do.
Because even though the CDO works for me and it's within the CIO, they're definitely broader than
Right,
that.
exactly.
They just happen to sit in our office. They
Yeah.
could, technically, they could sit somewhere else, but that's,
Yeah, they understand the data, where it comes from, how it works, how it moves, who they need to talk to from a knowledge perspective, which for us would be the administrators on the business side, all the way down to, where the
And how to use
CIOs are,
it.
and the data
Yep.
stewards and the actual data there.
Thank you
But
both, Joyce, Maria. Thank you so much for your time today.
live long and prosper.